So today we're going to talk about 21st century policing, which some of you know, that's the title of a report that came out from the President's task force on policing. And we're going to talk about what we can do to reform. And then as journalists, obviously, how can we cover the efforts to reform the criminal justice system in this country and to reform policing as we know it. So a little bit about the task force report. It has 6 pillars, and some of those pillars include building trust and legitimacy between police and community, policing the police, employing technology that might aid with transparency and accountability, and proper training for officers, among the other pillars. But before we sort of get into the discussion, I want to lay down some statistics. For decades, the criminal justice system has proven to be consistently unfair and deadly for Black people. We make up 13% of the nation's population. But as the President stated this summer when there were a couple of police shootings, in July, African Americans are 30% more likely than whites to be pulled over by police, as well as 3 times more likely to be searched, twice as likely to be arrested, twice as likely to be shot. So those are some of the stats that I want to throw out there. But we also know that police officers have a difficult and stressful job to do, and some of them have been slain in the line of duty. Some believe their job would be easier. Some people, I guess, believe their jobs would be easier if departments looked more like the people that they serve. In 2013, 27% of 477,000 full-time police officers across the country were racial minorities. About 12% of officers were female. So that said, here's my first question to the panel, but let me first introduce them. Forgot to do that. So we have with us Police Chief Anthony Holloway of the St. Pete's Police Department. We have Melba Pearson, the Miami-Dade State's of the Miami-Dade State's Attorney's Office, and April Frazier Kamara. She's with the National Legal Aid and Defense Association. Did I get everything right? Yes. Okay. So here's the first question. We've been talking about policing for a while now. For at least, well, we've been talking about it for decades, but in sort of this recent movement, we've been talking about it for 3 years. How do we reform and change sort of the epidemic of police violence in this country, and how Black people and people of color and poor people encounter the criminal justice system? So what, and this is for everyone, what are the current roadblocks to policing reform, if they're real or imagined? What are the roadblocks?
Well, I think the first roadblock is the open communication part of it. We've got to start this communication. We talk about it a lot, and we talk about it a lot. We put task force together, but we don't actually put actions into words. We don't teach these younger officers about what life really is about. When I say we, I blame us senior staff people. We were taught one way, and then as we transition throughout the years of law enforcement, we forgot how to teach these young officers what it's really to be a police officer. So part of the reform is to sit down, stop having conversations, put actions into words, start holding our younger generation officers accountable, and also hold the community accountable, and start having those conversations together.
I think some of the roadblocks include, first of all, understanding the scope of the problem and acknowledging that there is a problem. I mean, we all in this room know there is an issue. We're comfortable with that. But the police force as a whole needs to embrace that, yes, there's an issue and we need to implement changes to move forward. Once you take ownership of that, once ownership is taken of that, then I think good can move forward from there. And also, I'm noticing this trend of isolationism. So it's very like, Fox News camp versus CNN camp, right? You either firmly believe that there's a problem or there's no issues at all, and we're not going to talk to anyone in between. I'm going to stay in my camp and you stay in yours. So we need to get past that isolationism and really start to talk and engage to be able to implement policies that will help the community?
Actually, I really agree with Melva on the point that we have to really understand the scope of the problem. And I think the first step towards understanding the scope of the problem is for us to acknowledge our history and confront racism for what it is. And I think and this is beyond policing, I think it's about how we had a conversation about race in America. So most people are very familiar with Bryan Stevenson. And I think we really need to pay attention to the movement that he's trying to birth with the whole notion of confronting your history. So how can you move past the issue when you never fully addressed it? So we have to acknowledge the role that police have played in African American communities historically. We have to recognize that police traditionally, I'm from the South, they did carry with them many, they served the role of policing black communities to a very detrimental end. And so we have to own all of those things. So I think you have to start with fully confronting the history behind race and policing and how it relates to African American communities. And you have to do a reconciliation period where people can fully talk about what it has meant to them. I think about my own personal family history of having an uncle die in jail. You know, so that's not just my story. I think that's the story of a lot of people who have had very negative experiences with law enforcement. So I think you have to start by being willing to do the really hard work of fully understanding the scope of the problem, confronting the horrible, ugly history of race and policing in our country, and then we can really begin to start figuring out what the solutions are. But also, when we talk about solutions, you have to understand that this is not an easy fix. You're not going to be able to do implicit bias training and put cameras on everybody and the problem goes away. You have to really be willing to fully embrace the fact that this is going to be a very difficult thing to address. It's going to be very uncomfortable. And if people can embrace that, I think we can really truly have an honest dialogue about what we need to do to address this issue.
If you all are out there tweeting and talking about what we're discussing, the hashtag for Twitter is NABJ Law 16. NABJ Law 16 should be the hashtag that you use. So let's go a little bit deeper into some of the pillars of the 21st century task force report. One of the main one, and I think this is what not only the president but lots of civil rights activists talk about, is building trust and mutual respect between police officers and the communities that they serve, particularly communities of color. And that can be done, some say, through diversity recruitment, through special trainings like recognizing implicit bias, de-escalation of when it comes to encounters with citizens. So I want to toss this to Chief Holloway. Can you talk about what you've done in your department to address some of these issues, and whether it be from diversity or representation on the force and other trainings?
Yeah, and the first part of that 21st century policing, it really is old school policing. And I think as we forgot to go back to old school and do what we used to do, get out in the community. One project we started at St. Pete is called Park, Walk, and Talk. The officers, they have to get out of their cars 1 hour a week, park their cars, walk in the neighborhood and talk to people. Not making arrests, because that's what you're not supposed to do. We're not occupying the community. You will get out of your car and you will walk and you will talk to someone every day. We're in our second year of it. From 1 hour a week now, some officers are doing 2 and 3 hours. And they're starting to talk to people. Because 9 times out of 10, we used to call it negative contact. The only time you see a law enforcement officer in an African American community, we go in, we make an arrest, and we leave, and we never come back again. We go in, we make an arrest, and leave, we never come back. So that's all you saw. Every time that cruiser came into your community, that was it. It was there to harm someone. So now we're getting to the point to how do you help someone? The second part of that is we started a thing where how many people in this audience have never made a mistake in their life? Correct. And that's the next philosophy we looked at. Everybody in this world has made a mistake in life. So we started another program through the mayor called Second Chance. Meaning back to old school. You make a mistake, you're not going to jail. You do something on Monday, Saturday, you're going to show up and you're going to clean up something in the neighborhood or do something in that neighborhood. You get no record. Right now, we're holding about 95% of the kids that we do go through Second Chance have not reoffended. So in other words, they made that one contact, it's done, it's over with. The other part is implicit buying, and I'm tired of hearing that because we think we can take someone for 8 hours and teach them about their biases and then put them back out the street. Not going to happen. It took them 23, 24 years to get that thought in their head, and you think you're going to change that in 8 hours. It is not going to happen. So it is up to management staff to check and recheck. I think the Black Lives Movement has done a great job, part of it, because what it has done in law enforcement to the guys and gals in my position is it made us go back and look, because we started assuming everything. We assumed that these young officers weren't doing this. We assumed that they weren't making a racial profile traffic stop. And then when you start looking at numbers, you go like, something's wrong. It's absolutely something wrong when you're arresting the African Americans in your community. There's something wrong. Why is that? So then the question, like you said, and the question comes down to why are we making these arrests? What should we do differently? Recruitment. I don't think you should say things. I know you don't have to hire an African American officer to work in an African American community. Anyone can work in that community, but they have to become a part of that community. They should, if you're going to put a white officer in that community just for he or she to make an arrest, that's the problem. And I go back to that and I ask my staff, and we changed that. The question was, when you want to be promoted, we always ask, how many arrests did you make? What have you done today? So now we change the question. How many citizen contact have you arrested? And who do you know in the community? I don't want to know how many arrests you make because you know what? I can do that myself. Tell me about Ms. Jones, Ms. Smith. What have you done in that community? You want to be a sergeant, a lieutenant, a detective, so you start asking those questions. Because now they know they have to get the community, because back in the 80s, that's what was based upon. How many arrests you made was how do you get that next promotion? In other words, how many trophies did you have?
Do you, sorry to interject here, do you have a residency requirement for officers in your department?
No, we do not. As a chief, I do not live in my city. I've been a law enforcement officer for 31 years. I started when I was 12. And I've never lived in my city where I worked except for one time, because it becomes a part of that community. And I always tell the story here, long story short, is I worked in the African American community back in the 90s, and I got married on a Friday. For the guys in the audience, on a Saturday I went to work and I lost my wedding band. So you know what my wife said, would you take it off? Because she said, don't tell me you got married on a Friday, you come on Saturday night and never bring stuff. Took the ring off someplace. What happened was there was an incident in the African community and my ring came off where we used pepper spray or something. I went back out and I said, hey, I lost my ring last night. I need it back. Within 24 hours, someone turned my wedding band into. So that's when I said I became a part of that community. Married both sides. Because if we didn't have that relationship, it wouldn't have been there.
Before we move on to another topic, I want to ask to the entire panel, what can journalists do to sort of cover both sides of this? We do a lot of coverage of the shootings, do a lot of coverage of sort of community response to the shootings, but as Chief Holloway was talking about, do we do enough coverage of the other side of it, the community efforts, the community policing, the things that are happening where officers are trying to build relationships in their communities? And how do we do that work without seeming like we're trying to pump up the police or excuse their misconduct?
I think it's a matter of, you know, as an attorney, it's all about like laying a record, like laying a foundation. So when you're constantly chronicling everything that occurs in the community, so if for instance, I want to say it was in New York, that there was a story about fathers taking their children to school. It was just a particular day designated for fathers to take their children to school. You know, so you're documenting the good things that are happening in the community and the steps that the community is taking to be stronger and to be a more cohesive unit. And then when you see police departments rolling out interesting initiatives, you report on it, and of course, as journalists, you're objective in everything you do, or I guess that's the goal. You objectively report, you know, the police department has rolled out this particular initiative having to do with community policing. This is what they hope to achieve. You know, residents, please write us back and email us, let us know if this is working. So that way, journalists almost become an intermediary between the police and the community, talking about what's working, what's not. And everybody is aware of what the other is doing. Because I think a lot of times, the police department is not aware of what the community is doing, or what some of the churches are doing to uplift and improve communities. And a lot of communities don't always know the different initiatives that the police department has. There may be one press conference, and then nobody talks about it ever again. So it's that constant reminder of, hey, you know, we're all in this together, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to go home, everybody wants to be safe, and everybody wants to live a good life.
I think as journalists, you all have a responsibility to really, really get at the underlying issues in the community. So one thing that I agree with about this whole era that we're in society, police is not, the police is really a symptom of a larger problem. So you really have to talk about, why is the police being called in these communities, and the communities don't have access to other alternatives. And I'll give you an example of mental illness. The question is, in poor minority communities, we know mental illness affects all communities. So what happens in a wealthier suburb when you have a family member with a mental illness? How do you address that problem? They have access to private resources where perhaps they can call in a therapist or a team. They have insurance, so they can call service providers to come in and provide in-home services. Poor communities don't have access to the same types of services, so they call the police. So I don't want us to get misguided on focusing strictly on the police. I think the larger issue is why do communities of color, poor communities of color, only have access to the police? Why don't they have access to other services? Because I agree, I don't think it's the role of the police to solve every problem in the community. I think there should be other resources and other ways to address the issue. And of course, we see this going on with the opiate epidemic. All of a sudden, it's a public health issue, and now we want access to treatment because the communities don't look like us. So now, all of a sudden, we're going to take a different approach. But I think you all have a responsibility to talk about that underlying issue. Why wasn't that resource available during the 90s with the crack epidemic? So that's the type of coverage that I think you need to focus on, and don't get sidetracked with this whole us versus them, the police is the problem. No, the problem is the fact that we don't have equal access to services in poor communities of color. So the problem is people don't have jobs. So in Harlem, in Baltimore, and Southeast, at 10 o'clock, I live in Southeast, so 10 a.m., you got a whole corner full of people sitting on the curb and, you know, just really engaging in their everyday life because they don't have jobs. So that's a problem. That's what the coverage should be about. It shouldn't be about the fact that the police, you know, is coming, but, you know, of course, it's going to be contact because people don't have access to opportunities. So we need to shift the conversation and don't get distracted with this whole exclusive focus on the police, because the police is not the single source of our issues in the community.
I guess I'll just say amen to all that. Because you are the voice. People pay attention to what you write and what you put out in the media, and they need to hear that. I agree 100% with what this young lady had to say. We just talked about it. You know, 911, what's your emergency? And when you talk to African American communities, my kid won't go to school, and those are the type of calls. Those are not 911 calls. Those are calls to city council. Those are calls to your state representatives, your congress senators, because you get down, just because law enforcement is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we are not trained in that. We have 8 months to teach us all how to become cops, not all these other things. Parents, teachers, mental health, I mean, you name it. And it takes you to get that message out there. you have to ask that question, why is this happening? Why are the officers acting this way? Why is the community that way? Because we have to start drilling down to those facts. I think a lot of anger comes to the law enforcement because we are there. We're the ones that are out front, so we have to handle all those issues. So everything is turned toward us. I think it's time we have to start asking other people, why are these happening? And what can we do to help them? You're right. The heroin thing, totally shit. Crack cocaine. When it was crack cocaine, it was let's arrest them all. And you know what? And I was part of it, and I blame myself. We thought we could arrest our way out of this problem. And guess what? We created another problem because they're coming home. And then now what we're going to do.
And can I just add, even what we're seeing taking place in Charlotte right now, I think the real question should be, you know, the release of the video by the wife. I think the real question should be, once she said to law enforcement he has a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, why wasn't it a de-escalation to shift back? This person has a mental illness or a brain injury, maybe he cannot comprehend. Why wasn't the response to address that issue? And maybe we shouldn't be pulling, you know, weapons on somebody with a traumatic brain injury, you know. So, and it's another conversation about why are we doing open warrant, you know, arrest at 4 p.m. in the daytime when children are coming home from school in communities of color. Why would you even want to take somebody down at 4 p.m. during the day for children coming home from school to be able to witness that? That's traumatic for you to see that in your community. So we should be having conversations about I think those are underlying conversations we should be having about how we respond to issues like that. Not, yeah, so I just think the conversations are clouded, and I don't think we ever really address the root issue. But this whole notion of poor communities of colors don't have access to, the reason they call 911 is because they have gone down to the city hall. They come to the public defender office. They come to the court saying, I can't get my child to go to school, and they don't have any responses to their cries for help. So they just decide, I'm going to pick up the phone and call the police, and maybe, you know, maybe I can get some assistance.
And another thing that I just wanted to piggyback on what was being said, you know, so when we are having these discussions about policing and Black Lives Matter and, you know, why is it that everybody wants to protest when an officer shoots a black man or when a black man shoots another black man, you know, nobody has an outcry. I think the way that journalists can help with that is to, I mean, I know in Miami, every time a child is shot, there's a vigil, there's a march, there's an outcry of some sort, but that's not being reported. I may hear about it once in a while on local radio, but it's not covered in the news, in the newspaper. It's not necessarily on the internet. So I think it's very important in order to have that even discussion, like, yes, actually there is an outcry whenever someone dies, generally, is to make sure that not only those protests that are happening in Charlotte and around the country are being covered, but also the community response to violence within their own community and how communities are seeking and crying out for justice as well. So that sort of neutralizes that whole argument like, well, y'all don't care if it happens in your community, but you only care when it's a police officer. That's patently untrue.
So, April, you mentioned the circumstances of the shooting in Charlotte, and specifically Keith Scott's wife being there, begging almost, well not almost, she's begging that they not shoot her husband, and telling him he has a disability, he has a traumatic brain injury. Obviously there's something there that can be addressed, and I don't know if we can yet label that as misconduct, because that may be within what the way the officer acted, that may be how they were trained, and maybe within totally within policy. So I don't want to necessarily label it misconduct, but if it is found to be misconduct, I want to move on to talking about sort of accountability for that misconduct in police departments, and how the community can be more involved with pushing for that accountability. That's part of what has been talked about in the movement. So a lot of times that takes the form of civilian police review boards, where you've got members of the community appointed to a board to review disciplinary cases and even have sometimes the power to either recommend or actually fire officers that are found, that committed some sort of misconduct. So, just from stepping back a little bit, Melba, I want to know if, in your work, how much community involvement and cooperation helps you do your job, and how do you encourage more of that, especially in this area of holding police accountable when they may have done something wrong?
So one of the things that I always encourage prosecutors' offices as well as police departments to do across the country is to be involved in the community before there's a tragedy. Because you can't roll up in Charlotte, let's say, if you haven't been engaged in the community before. You can't now come after there's been a shooting and try to build that trust in that relationship. That trust has to be there beforehand. So the key is to proactively be working with the faith leaders and other community leaders to let them know, okay, when there's a police shooting, this is the process we have to go through. This is why it takes so long. Make sure they understand all the dynamics that are involved. So the first assumption is not like, oh, it's a cover-up. No, I have certain protocols and a checklist I need to go through before I can file charges or decide not to file charges. So once that relationship is built and the community trusts you and know that you're going to do your best and you're going to get all the evidence and be thorough and be just in your work, that de-escalates a lot of the anger and the upset because people just don't understand what the process is. Now, turning to civilian review boards, I haven't always found it to be the most effective model because
Studies have shown that they aren't.
I can back up the studies in my own eyes because nothing really comes of it. So the concept is great, but the ability to force a department to follow the recommendations, there's lack of teeth there. So like a paper tiger. I don't know if the answer is just to not do civilian review boards at all because it's a waste of time. I don't know what the true answer is. All I know is that we have a serious problem. And the only way we're going to be able to move forward is to really take a systemic look at police shooting policy, at the standard, that's the legal standard for filing charges, and really work with officers with regards to the training aspect and understanding and learning the communities that they serve. Again, knowing about Ms. Jones or knowing that Mr. Jones has TBI, knowing the people in the community because it's harder to be afraid of people you know. It's very easy to detach yourself from people you don't know. And then as a result of that fear, you then, engage with violence.
Chief Holloway, I'm wondering, we often hear from police unions that civilian police review boards are sort of a non-starter, and that police officers generally aren't very excited about the idea of civilians being able to make those calls. If these boards aren't the answer, what are some of the other things that you would support when it comes to making a department more transparent in how it evaluates an officer, how it disciplines an officer, so that the community trusts that you are taking their concerns seriously?
Well, from different states it varies, and I'll just use the state of Florida that I'm aware of. So after a chief or a sheriff make a decision, that decision is also still forwarded to call it a commission. And those are made up of other chiefs and other sheriffs, so they can turn around, even though I say, you know what, my guy didn't do anything wrong, the Florida Law Enforcement Commission can yank that officer certification. So it doesn't matter what I said, it's like those other chiefs said, you know what, you guys may be buddies, but we're pulling the certification, so he can't be a cop no longer. So I think just like the bar and everything else, having a professional group look at it. I agree with you with the review panel. I have one. They've come back twice, and they said we've done too much punishment on the officers, because that's just the way it is according to who's on that panel. I think you need the experts to look at that, but then on the same side, I think you need some civilians sitting on that professional panel with those other chiefs and other sheriffs that have to say so they can look at it. That also, he or she is working in seconds and minutes, and then you get a chance to work in days and months. but at the same time, it should be someone else looking. I think lawyers, I know the lawyers have it, they get a review from it. I was very fortunate to sit on one this past year with the Board of Governors. And after I listened to that, I go like, wow, you people really do enforce what you do out there to each other. So I think the same thing with law enforcement. There needs to be a separate group to look at that law enforcement agency. But if that chief, he or she, that sheriff make that decision, then that decision goes to another panel for their final review.
Okay, but that panel isn't, because some people would be concerned that if that panel is outside of the community, is that the best thing for the community to, you know, trust that then another outside group is, or not another one, but a completely independent or unattached or uninvested group is making a decision?
Well, the biggest thing is we, in law enforcement, got to get that trust back in the community. You know, it's not going to be done overnight. We did this to ourselves in certain cases. So we've got to come back, and obviously the 1%. The 1% are driving this narrative. The other 99% of law enforcement are trying to get it back on track. But until there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies out there. So there's 18,000 of these people doing things. Come up with a standard so we can drive our message the same way.
I want to kind of talk now some about technology. You know, police body cameras seem to be the hot topic for a couple of years, and now I think the recent police shootings, it's now become an issue as well. So what? There's video. Police can still take a look at it and determine if the officer did what policy says he or she should do. So I'm wondering if there's a conversation, this is for everyone, if there's a conversation we need to have about surveillance, police surveillance, policing the police from the public view. If there's anything that you've seen that works or isn't currently happening but needs to happen so that you know, there is evidence when someone says, hey, yes, this officer didn't do right by me.
So I just want to, going back to the effectiveness thing, I think we have to, and I am once again talking to journalists, I think it's something that you all can do a lot of work on, really studying the effectiveness of certain models before we get a whole community of people behind advocating for certain solutions. So even with body cams, there are a host of issues surrounding that. As a defense attorney, the question is, will you have access to the footage, the whole footage, not just what prosecutors want to turn over to you? But when we talk about what the solutions are, whether it's civilian review boards or whatever, I really want to highlight, and I think more coverage should be done by journalists about the power of prosecutors, the role of prosecutors. Very rarely do we see coverage of the power that they have. In Chicago, I was very happy to see the Black Lives Matter movement actually connect the dots and say we need to focus on, they had a Buy Anita campaign where they voted out the district attorney. Yeah, so I think people need to really, when you talk about who has power, you really need to fully understand the role of prosecutors, and you need to ask the questions whether or not they have transparency in their own offices. Have they disclosed to the community? Melba talked about it, but disclose to the community your process for investigating cases. So we can hold you accountable whether or not, like in Charlotte, if we knew what their internal procedure was to investigate police shootings, perhaps people wouldn't react to the fact that you're withholding the official footage. But not only disclose it to us, but the community should be a part of creating those policies where we can feel like it's a fair process when you engage in this work. So I really would encourage you all to really look at the power of prosecutors. Also look at the lack of minority representation within elected prosecutors and chief prosecutors. Actually in Brooklyn, I'm looking at Charles, like the election of the black DA in Brooklyn was like historic. And everybody it wasn't even covered on the level that it should have been covered, because he was the first elected black prosecutor in the state of New York. That's huge. But it also tells us something about why are communities of color, why is there a position within our community where minorities are not represented within that leadership structure? So I really would encourage you all to take a look at prosecutors, the election of prosecutors, the dynamics of prosecutors being held accountable to the community. How do they engage with the community? I spent my last 2 years at home in Memphis, Tennessee, and the prosecutor down there, like, accountability. Like, she had concerns about the use of body cameras. And is the community holding her responsible as their elected official to kind of get it right with the community as far as making sure you are articulating the concerns of our community when you come up with policies and you take positions on things. So I really think the most effective tool as far as police relations and community relations is really, we need to take a really close look at the role of prosecutors.
Right, because the prosecutors, to your point, the prosecutors often will make a decision to release their investigation to the public, and that can include the video files or audio files that you then see.
And is it open file, this stuff? Do they disclose everything? Or, I mean, there should be rules about what information is released to the public. If you're withholding certain information, then we should understand why you're withholding certain information. So, but you need to have those conversations before the police shooting. Like, you need to actively be engaged in that level of advocacy now. So when the incident occurs, you have a very clear understanding about what your local prosecutor's rules are and policies.
And, you know, just to piggyback on what April's saying, I mean, yeah, it's really lonely for me. Okay, I'm not even gonna front. It's like, so the Women's Donor Network did a study that was, you know, published last year, where it focused and revealed that 95% of elected prosecutors are white and white men. Not even white men. Okay, so you look at the top, you already see the issue, and then when you go into the rank and file. I mean, their offices, you know, I'm the immediate past president of the National Black Prosecutors Association. We don't have a huge membership roster, and there's a reason for that, you know? The bottom line is, I mean, I'll talk to folks who are the only one in their office. And when it's tough when you're in that position and you recognize certain issues, and then you try to bring that to the forefront, and if you're not within a structure that's receptive, then it's hard to make those changes. And it's very difficult to get to the top because, again, when it comes to the electoral process, folks don't come out to vote. They think the only time to vote is during a presidential election. But electing a prosecutor, electing your state senator, I mean, these are people who have an effect on your day-to-day life. I mean, the president, yeah, that's important, but he doesn't affect your living, breathing, day-to-day life, policing every day in your community. So I think it's very important that as journalists, you really cover those types of elections, the candidates that are running, you know, wondering, okay, why is it that there's no one of color or minority that's involved in these races? You know, and some of the hurdles, again, is fundraising. You know, we don't have that transfer of wealth or that mantle of leadership that's passed down from generation to generation, where, you know, daddy gave you $500,000 for your campaign. You got to go out and hustle, you know, and that makes it daunting, so a lot of folks don't go that route. And as a result, that lack of representation, those discussions, those critical discussions that should be happening in the community are not happening. So,
I just want to end on one note about the role of prosecutors. But one thing that was very disappointing about the Eric Gardner situation was the fact that their prosecutor was reelected. I think it was last year, but that election cycle, it was not enough focus on that, understanding for that to have taken place in Staten Island, and I know that they have issues with, it's not a large minority population, but the fact that that district attorney was voted back into office, and there was almost no real coverage of that. So I just think really empowering our communities to understand where the key decision making is taking place, and for them to focus their energy on the key decision making points, I think is really the role of journalists, to get people to wake up and realize where you should focus your energy and where real reform has to take place.
Chief Holloway, does your department have a good relationship with the prosecutors who work with you?
Oh, we do. They have, every case that we have, it has to be reviewed by the prosecutor before we move forward. And our circuit is called State Attorney's Invest. I think other circuits don't have that, that we're the only ones. So after the officer makes an arrest, he or she has to go before the state attorney's office and have their case reviewed. And at that time, the state attorney can drop the case prior to going to trial. But they have to go over the case again. And if I could say one thing about body cameras, I know we just finished up a task force with the American Bar Association. You have to start your voice here in this case. We really want you guys and gals to talk about it. I'm 100% for body cameras. The problem is expectation of privacy. What are you willing to give up? We in law enforcement, don't take this the wrong way, we trust you journalists. We really do, because you know what, we do something wrong, we want to give you that tape, because you need to get the story out. Our problem comes into that nosy person down the street that wants a copy of every tape that we have to give it up to them. So it's, again, what are you willing to give up? So if you have a discussion with your significant other or whoever out in the middle of the street with us as a personal matter, and he says, you know what, I saw the police officers over there, so I want a copy of that tape. We have to give that up. Even though there was no law enforcement action, we have to give that up. So we've gone too far with body cams in certain states. If there's misconduct, then that person that's involved in it should sign off and say, here you go. Or if we're involved in the shooting, here you go, press, get it out there. But until we decide on what we're going to do with this information, you're going to see a lot of chiefs like me. I'm against it right now because there is no laws in effect that can protect your right to privacy. And that's my own problem.
There's really no national standard for how we deal with the body cam footage. So that sort of creates a patchwork all over the country.
And there is a company that's out there that everybody's blocking. Take a look at it. There's a company out there that has a camera that's mounted on the police officer's gun. Nobody wants to talk about that because my union said right away, we'll buy it today. Because once you pull your weapon, it starts recording. So you see everything that happens. No one wants that because you don't make any money because all that storage. Because if you pull a weapon, it says on word to the supervisor saying you pulled your weapon and it starts recording. Well, if you look at the software company, they don't make any money off of that because they want that footage for storage every day. Because it costs a fortune to store all that footage.
Okay, so I'm going to open up for questions in a little bit here. I have a couple more questions that I want to pose to the panel, and it kind of goes now to bigger picture about how do we help residents, especially as journalists, how do we help readers understand more about our law enforcement system in this country, the criminal justice system, because too often a lot of the protests that we see are spurred by misunderstandings of the criminal justice system. I think one example I can give is sort of the idea that immediately after a police shooting, the family and the community calls for a DOJ investigation, not understanding that not only does the DOJ's Civil Rights Division have a very small staff and cannot handle every single police shooting that happens around the country, especially where the ones that make national news, but really the DOJ is there as a backstop. It's supposed to be the local folks that take this stuff up first. They are supposed to have the capacity to fairly and quickly investigate any case and make a determination. If it seems like they're not going to do their job, if they've not done it fairly, then yeah, sure, the DOJ can step in. But so I'm saying all that to say, sometimes it takes really educating the public more about how the criminal justice system works, how prosecutors work, how police do investigations. So my next question, well, actually to April, is, as a public defender, are you sort of ever shocked or surprised that the inner workings of our criminal justice system remains a mystery to people who you come into contact with?
Actually, within the public defense community, probably about 15 or 20 years ago, the notion of community-oriented defense became a movement where a lot of public defender offices across the country are shifting to a more holistic view of how we practice and how we engage our clients, but also doing it from a community-oriented perspective. Because I also want you all to write about and raise the issues about what the public defender's responsibility is within the community. Because there is also a problem with traditional public defender offices who see their role only to handle cases. So a client is a case number as opposed to an individual person with real issues. So within the public defender community, there has been this shift to be more community oriented. What does that mean? So I want to go to, I actually worked in the community defender office at the DC Public Defender Service. So for me, my job didn't end at 5:30. I went to community meetings. Oftentimes it was to counter, prosecutors were there. They were there in the afternoons talking to communities about certain issues, holding community meetings. And it's also important for public defenders to be a part of those conversations. But also, we have a role to play with educating and making sure the community understand what their rights are. Because we want you to call us before you get in trouble. We want to be engaged with the community when you notice that a police officer is harassing you. Before they get to the level of actually charging you, we want you to come to our office and tell us what the issues are. And if it's some systemic issues about how the police is engaged in their community, we want to play a role in solving those problems as well. So it's really important that journalists also hold public defenders accountable for what is their responsibility to the community and what role should they play in addressing these larger systemic issues. And there is a lot of offices who are community oriented, but you have a lot of offices who are still traditional. And all they, handle is the case when it comes before them, and it's a problem. And the same way she talks about, Melba talks about the lack of diversity in leadership, it's a lack of diversity in public defender leadership. The overwhelming majority of chief public defenders are white men. So it's a question about whether or not public defender offices really truly understand the communities that they serve as well. And I think you should hold them accountable the same way you hold a prosecutor or a police department accountable. Does the public defender in the community get the problems of the local communities that they're serving?
And I think also, as journalists, it'd be really cool to do that sort of like Civics 101 that we all kind of missed in high school, right? So basically explaining, all right, so a case, this is how a case gets to trial. The basics. This is the standard, things have to be proved, cases have to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. A lot of people don't even understand what that concept means. And not everybody gets to serve on a jury. So if you've never had that interaction, if you've never had, God forbid, someone in your family, be involved in the criminal justice system, the only standards you have is law and order. And that's not exactly reality. So, like CSI, like, yeah, you can get, evidence off of somebody's eyeballs, and all of a sudden, that's the last image they saw is the murderer. I mean, but I have jurors that come in and seriously think that. And I'm like, no, boo-boo. All right, our CSI does not come in a Hummer. So, I mean, these are all myths that I think as journalists you can help dispel and really explain this is what happens in our system. I mean, I blog and I write, and everything I do is an explanatory piece on this is why this case happened this way. So,
Chief Holloway, what do you do when you have questions about how you investigate or whether or not you're disciplining an officer? How do you explain to them the process for how that works? When someone logs a complaint, how do you tell them this is what's going to happen to your complaint now that you filed it?
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job explaining it to our citizens, but I think for journalists, I think you should get ahead of it. I think you should get with your local official and ask him or her to walk you through the process. What is your shooting board? What does it consist of? How do you do your reviews? And walk me through the process so when it does happen, you can be very educated and explain to your people that are reading your paper or watching news, this is how they do it. Because a lot of times, you come in, you get that 5-minute interview with the chief or the sheriff, and you go back. Find out exactly why is it done this way. What are the union contracts? Why is that also put on paid administrative leave? Why is this? Why is it done this way? Walk the people through the process. A lot of times, it doesn't make sense, because I'll look at something from another agency, like, why did you do that? But I don't know the policy. So I would say get with your local official and ask him or her to put that policy on the table and have them walk you through it. I have no problem with, we've done it before, have one of our president on one of our shooting boards, and she'll give them a mock of what happens in that shooting board. So they'll see it, so they'll know exactly what's going on there.
I actually want to open it up to questions now, and just start right
Hi,
here.
thanks, Aaron. So I have a question for the panel regarding Cheryl and Eichel did an op-ed in the Washington Post where she urged the federal government to start to withhold federal funding of local police forces until they deal with the issues of systemic racism in their departments. And I was excited to see it because I hadn't thought of that option as a way to accelerate local police forces and to give them some incentive to take this issue seriously. And so, of course, I'm interested in hearing what the chief has to say, but how realistic is this? How do you see this playing out?
This might get myself in trouble. I think it's a great idea because, like I said, I would say 3 years ago, I would have told you, no, that's not happening. No, my guys and gals are not doing that. Every month I get a report on all traffic stops, all stop and frisk, because I want to see that number. And the division head, he or she should want to know that because it is there. And if we don't break the cycle up at the top, then it's never going to get broken.
From my perspective, I have concerns, and the reason being, when you withhold funding from a police department, they're going to have to start cutting things. And what do they cut? They cut the community policing program. They cut victim services, where if somebody is victimized, they will have a counselor or an advocate help walk them through the process. That person's going to get fired. So that's where my concern lies. I like the idea as a general premise, but I'm afraid that once implemented, it's only going to end up hurting the community and not necessarily resolving the issue. I'm not saying throw the baby out the bathwater, no way, we can't do that, but maybe there needs to be some kind of restrictions that you can't cut certain programming, but again, I don't know how you would enforce that. So that's where my concern is about.
And I guess when we add on to that, because we were involved in community policing until 9/11, but all the funding went away from community policing, everybody cut out community policing, and everybody focused on terrorism. So, yeah, so we left the community, and some communities will tell you that. We were working hand in hand, and some of you probably remember, up with hope, down with dope, we did all the marches, and everybody was like this. We were like this, we were. And we were moving people out with the Weed and Seed program. 9/11 happened, bye-bye. We like you said, I went before city council and said, you know what, I gotta cut this program. And you talk about cutting community policing, not one word. What are you doing as far as building up your intelligence unit, and what are you doing about terrorism? And we left our African American community, and now we're trying to come back.
And I just want to say one thing. I'm in support of it. Our organization signed on to the letter that the proposal that she was referencing in the piece. But for my last 2 years of returning home to Memphis, Tennessee to do Department of Justice reform within the juvenile justice system, I would caution anyone for inputting a lot of focus on the role of the federal government. Everything is local. So if you don't have a local community who is dedicated, educated, empowered to actually seeing those reforms through and being an active agent of change, the federal government role is only so much, and it is very limited, and we should learn from our past. We should look at the civil rights movement, specifically education reform with Brown v. Board of Education. We're even more segregated now than we were before. We need to look at where were the failures in the implementation of desegregation policies. The failures come in because at the end of the day, the federal government is not on the ground every day in those communities, making sure that people are held accountable. The local communities are the only people who are going to be able to solve their problem, and the federal government has a very limited role, and we have to acknowledge that. So I caution a lot of coverage focusing so much on the federal government. We need to talk about state and local solutions.
I want to go to this gentleman here in the green time and we'll go back.
Thank you. I'm Kelvin Childs. I'm a copy editor with Smart Brief Incorporated. After the Freddie Gray matter in Baltimore, the Baltimore City paper did a package 1 year later. And part of that package, they spoke to the Baltimore Police Commissioner. And one thing he said in there was that part of his challenge was to alter the culture of the Baltimore Police Department from a warrior's mentality to a protector's mentality. You mentioned just briefly about how the police department had become militarized. And we've seen that since the 70s with the dawn of SWAT teams. We've seen it in the 80s with the war on drugs that led to police departments supporting themselves with asset forfeiture. And we see it since 9/11 where the police departments are buying surplus military equipment, outfitting their officers with weapons, with even military uniforms, even military camouflage in cities. So my question is going away from a warrior's mentality to a protector's mentality a desirable goal? I mean, we saw this just last week with this poor gentleman in Oklahoma where he's a stranded motorist who needs help, but he's treated like a threat who has to be put down. What steps can be taken to bring us away from a warrior's mentality to a protector's mentality, where you see a gentleman in stress like that, and officers on the scene treat him as someone who needs help and not someone who needs to be attacked? I mean, this man was even tased before he was shot at.
And if you can keep your answers brief, because I want to make sure it's
sure.
Basically, again, and I was back in the 80s when we started weed and seed, and again, I have to blame myself, I'm part of that. We were teaching officers how to weed, and we forgot to teach them how to seed. So now we're going back and trying to teach them how to seed in the community. And that's just going to take some time to change that pendulum back the other direction. Some of the equipment we're getting it for protect you and protect ourselves. If you would have told me 20 years ago I would need all this equipment so someone would shoot, I would tell you out of your mind. But we do need that type of stuff. It needs to stay in one place. When you need it, bring it out. But just don't bring it out for every little thing that you're having.
And I would just say, confront our history. You have to deal with the dehumanization of people of color, the fact how you view black people, black skin. If you don't have that conversation, and also what does it mean when you are a white officer who comes to work every day for 8 hours, you arrest 90% of nothing but African Americans? What does that do to your psyche? The fact that that is the complete target of what you do for 8 hours a day. If you got a DC Superior Court, 95% of the people being arraigned are African Americans. And look at the composition of our city. We are no longer the majority in the city, but that we are that's all you see in the criminal justice system. So let's have a conversation. Let's be honest with these officers. What has it trained their brain to think about people of color? And that's what you're seeing play out in Tulsa. Because when that's your focus and that's what you do 8 hours a day, you dehumanize people.
And just quickly to piggyback, I think burnout is a real issue because nobody's calling you as a police officer, oh look, I baked some cookies and Johnny got an A on his exam. Like that, you're only coming in when people are in trauma. So dealing with that trauma as a police officer day after day after day after day is going to mess with your psyche, is going to mess with the way you view. You may not come in quote unquote racist, but after viewing people in such a negative lens for 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, and keep multiplying, that's going to really mess with your psyche. So I believe that we should do rotation of officers, where officers, if you start to get burned out, or it's a year or 2 years, whatever it is, you work in a particular community and then you get rotated somewhere else, so that you don't have time for that negative programming, I guess, to happen.
All right. Here in the green tie, then I want to move here and then come right back to you.
I have a quick comment and a question. The comment is, I think we have a lot of conversation about the social justice system, well, really the criminal justice system being broken, and I understand why that is, but I think for average people who hear that, they don't necessarily know what that means. And so when we talk about what stories need to be told or what stories need to be examined, I think there is, and speaking as a former prosecutor, I will say, rightfully so, some discomfort between the way that police and prosecutors are in bed with each other in a lot of ways. And I think that that warrants some examination. I think in terms of what stories need to be told and what things need to be examined, we really need to look at the strength of police unions in this country and how that contributes to the way criminal justice plays out. Because these are the examples of what people mean when they say the criminal justice system is broken. So that is a sort of a comment in line with this panel that I would submit to some of the journalists in the room. But the question I had to the chief is, oftentimes we hear conversation from police and from law enforcement. Well, first of all, let me say, it's refreshing to hear a member of the law enforcement community say we can do our jobs better. Because what I find when I'm in spaces typically is that law enforcement is the only community in the world who all of a sudden it's always something else or some other fault or some other circumstance that we don't understand because we've never been a cop. Well, my response is, you ain't never been a lawyer. So, you know, that goes without saying. The most troubling thing aside from that I find is the aspect of police culture that is commonly referred to as the blue wall of silence. People oftentimes say, well, all cops aren't bad. We know that, but in times of crisis and in times of emergency, when those other officers don't step up, we cannot tell the difference between the officers who aren't bad and the officers who are. So I'm convinced, primarily from my own experience and from talking to other officers, oftentimes in different precincts, officers know who the rogue folks are. So you don't get a Sam DuBose, you don't get a Michael Brelow, you don't get a Walter Scott. Like, these things don't just happen because there are signs that officers see earlier on in terms of someone being a little bit aggressive, being a hothead, not dealing with their emotions well, so on and so forth. And when these things happen, there are two problems. Number one, why was no one in that precinct speaking up before? And number two, why is it all of a sudden a defensive posture of, well, we're not all bad?
So can you answer that question there, just directly to addressing it earlier?
And again, and I talked, you know, that 1% that are doing that, I can actually say we just had that where an officer, cause in my policy, once the guy's handcuffed, it's over, game over. Where another officer took that guy down, tripped him and threw him down to the ground. Those two officers reported it, and he was fired the next day, well, fired after his hearing. Because a lot of chiefs and sheriffs are saying the same thing. If you're there and you don't say anything, you're just as dirty as the other person. So therefore, I'm going after everybody in that circle. So either you say something, or when it comes to the IA investigation, then now you're a subject officer also. And it's just going to take time to get there, but everybody's seeing that now.
Charles, you bring up, you say the blue code of silence, but can we talk about the white code of silence? And how do we get the white community to feel the pain that's taking place in the black community right now, to feel the horror that you feel as a mother sending your black sons or black daughters out in the community? I think we have to talk about the silence within other communities. Where is the outrage? Because it shouldn't just be communities of color that's outraged about this police, and it's not just a policing issue, but I want people to address that within journalism. Like, how do you get other communities to share in the outrage? And how do you talk about the white code of silence?
Okay, we've got 5 more minutes. I'm going to come here. Did you still have a question?
Yes, thank you.
And then I'll go back to the reporter in blue. I forget. Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Greg.
Yes. Can we?
The whole policing issue is something that I've paid attention to for quite a while.
Excuse me, can you identify yourself, sir?
Excuse me?
Can you say your name?
Oh, Philip Houle, Houle, retired federal worker over 35 years. Before I joined the government, I was a public defender, legal aid lawyer in Kansas City, Missouri, New Hampshire, and Maine, where I'm from originally. And I have known some dirty hairs personally. In fact, I went to high school with two that probably could have taken the prize in the Dirty Harry category. One thing that I have heard complaints about over time is how officers that are involved in, I guess, high enough visibility matters, or perhaps anything, have a fairly long time, measured perhaps in weeks, before they are required to make a statement to their chief, to the department, to the oversight board.
So what?
Just wondering how you all feel about that, and if perhaps the law or the rules in that regard might be modified. Thank you.
And I'll say that probably addressed me. It's a union issue than lawyers. Their lawyers are saying this was the process they have to go through. And again, I said earlier, you have to know the process. It's a different state, different thing. So if their union says that and their Bill of Rights says this, then I'm not going to violate their rules or the Bill of Rights, because if I do something, I'm going to affect their case. If I order an officer, I'll use Ford to vote for Ford. If I compel an officer to give a statement, she can't use it. And only can use it for administrative reasons. So he can say, okay, yeah, I shot the person, but I can't tell her. So it's kind of like we have to wait for the prosecutor to do her case and then come back. So again, that's that part of explaining to the community why it happens that way.
Yeah, I mean, the police officers have a lot of rights in that situation. You know, when I investigate police shootings, I can talk to everybody else except the officer who actually pulled the trigger. So I have to wait until, you know, that whole process is finished, and then maybe 6 months later, if at all, I may get a statement, I may not. So I'm supposed to put together a case, you know, basically circumstantially, and that can be an uphill battle, and that is part of the reason why a lot of these shooting cases are filed.
Question here.
I wanted to talk about this issue of unions. I mean, I just did a story the other day about the national FOP endorsing Donald Trump and how this impacts community policing. Yeah, they did. And a lot of the locals followed suit. Should reporters dig in more to, because I know our commissioner kind of pushes it off a lot, you know, to the union, saying they fired all these officers and 70% of them get their job back with back pay. Should reporters dig into these unions and really, because I don't even know if people know when these negotiations of contracts happen. Like, I mean, should more light be put on them? Do you feel like it's unfair that people kind of attack the police and not really see that a big part of it is the strength of this union?
And you're absolutely correct. This is a big thing, because what the national union may decide on, the locals may say something totally different. In my area, there's 26 different municipalities. So there's the PBA, the FOP, and this group, and they may not agree. And again, because I work in 2 areas, I'll make it real short. Up north, if an officer gets caught with cocaine, he or she gets suspended. In Florida, you're fired. Totally 2 different things. And the guys and gals in Florida say, wait a minute, he got suspended for cocaine, but I get fired in Florida for cocaine? And that's how the union works out. It's according where you are in the state.
But I mean, is there this, because I don't know, do you feel like it's unfair that because a lot of the coverage is focused on, you know, the police, and no one really reports on the unions? Do you feel it's unfair? Are we doing the right thing? Should we be shifting our focus in some respects?
No, because again, you need to focus on that individual agency. When you say the union, because the unions vary from place to place. Some unions will say, you know what, I disagree with what they're doing up north, and we're not going to support that.
But I just to chime in, I think you should be, because unions will make and break elections.
I'm going to
They have power.
take a final question. I think you had your hand.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Lamont Summers. I'm assistant professor at Morgan State University in the School of Global Journalism and Communication. The panel, you were mentioning that you need to have more black folks elected as prosecutors. Journalists need to also explain criminal justice system, etc. Well, in Baltimore, we did have, Marilyn Mosley was elected. She overcame, voters there voted in, overcame an incumbent. We have a black mayor. The judge in the Freddie Gray case was black. but yet the judge in that case imposed a gag order, and so we couldn't talk about it. It was very difficult to talk about the case, and 3 of the police officers were found not guilty by the judge. So I'm wondering, does it really matter when you have black folks in those positions that we talked about? Does it really matter in terms of having those in place? Is it going to end up making a difference? Because we still don't have, according to many of the folks in Baltimore, we still have not had justice for Freddie Gray.
Right, right.
But the critical thing is that when you have someone who understands the experience in a position of power, that affects the policies and procedures. I mean, there are head prosecutors across the country who have decided they're not going to enforce marijuana arrests, misdemeanor marijuana arrests, because they see how it disproportionately affects communities of color. So to say that, oh, it doesn't matter the racial composition, no, it absolutely does. And you know, I've brought this news before, you know, really taking a stand and going after it, because maybe another prosecutor may not have, and been like, you know what, this case is a dead dog to lose, or I'm not doing it.
And one thing I want to say, just because you're African American or a person of color, that does not mean that you are awake. So, I don't want to interchange the two to mean the same thing. So you have to do more than just elect a person of color, but you have to elect a person of color who reflects the concerns and needs of the community. And also, you have to understand what everyone's role is within within the existing very broken criminal justice system. So when you talk about the judge and the gag order, you have to understand, even if you're a person of color, you're working within a very broken system. So and so we have to dissect the two and really truly understand. Even when you're elected, even President Obama, he is working within a construct. What can he do within the construct? And for you to push him to do as much as he can within the role that he plays. So I think that's a very important conversation. And so you have to understand the system in order for you to put demands on the table for black elected officials and come up with realistic things that they can do within the structure in which they sit. So there's a lot of problems perhaps with the system in Baltimore. And even if you are elected, you're upholding that very broken system.
Well, I think we're going to end it there. We're going to end it there. We want to thank our panelists, Chief Holloway, Dr. Pearson, President Camara, for holding, I think, was a pretty productive and informative discussion.